our best with the webcam, but this is this big old roll of chrome tanned leather from Weaver, which is garment leather. So this is, if you want links to all of the materials, I can email those out after.
Yes, please.
Alrighty, so I can email those out to everybody. But we're actually not going to start with the body first. We're going to start with some of the pockets because 2 hours is a little bit tight with all of the dry time and sewing we have to do. And this pocket for a box cutter, which is one of the more important tools I use every day, has to dry because we're going to be wet molding it, and that can take a good long while. So that's where we're going to start. And then I can explain more about other patterns sort of as we go. But this is my box cutter here, and I cut just about everything with this. Sometimes for super thin stuff, I'll go down to an X-Acto, but this is how I cut just about everything. And this is just a scrap of 4 to 5 ounce natural veg tan. And the veg tan is really what's important. The weight is a lot more you have a lot more wiggle room on that for something like this. But the nice thing about veg tan is once it gets wet, you can mold it, you can form it around different shapes. And I wish I'd brought a cool example, but like if you see lots of really cool leather pouches where it's got a big bulge and there's no gusset on it, that's how they do that. So this is all tanned with like oak bark and other natural things like this. So this takes about 3 to 6 months, depending on the recipe, to go from a rawhide to this kind of leather. The main body we're going to be using is chrome tan. That's using chromium salts, and that can take as quick as 3 days. That was created in the 18th century for clothes and things because it's quicker, less expensive, but it will react with the metal on your tools. So you can't use it for things like holsters or sheaths or things like that because it'll react and you'll get all sorts of corrosion and nastiness that you don't want. So all I've done to this piece, this is the color it starts as when you buy it, and it's nice and rigid and beautiful. But all I've done is I soaked this just in the sink and got it nice and saturated, and then I let it dry for about 5 minutes. And now you can see on the scrap here, it's super pliable. I can stretch it, and it kind of holds that shape a little bit. So I marked off about 1.5 inches down from the top of my knife there on the side that's going to be the outside, because I'm going to wear this on the right side of my apron because I'm a righty, and you always want your blade going back traditionally just because it's safer. It's not really an issue with something like this where the blade retracts, but that's just sort of how it's traditionally done. So I've marked 1.5 inches from the top there, and I'm going to do my best to make sure you can see what I'm doing here. I'm going to lay this with that mark right up against this straight edge that I cut here along the top. And I'm just going to kind of roughly mark with a scratch awl here about 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch around the outside, and just cut it nice and rough because we're going to trim this flush to its back piece later. So this, you want to make sure you have plenty of room to mold down around the knife and then also to trim off later. So you have enough to grab onto and all of that. So this is just a scratch awl. You can use a nail. I've seen people use a sewing needle, but what it does is it just puts like a nice scratch in there that is horrible at showing up on camera, which I realized the second I started trying to do stuff for YouTube. But in person, it shows up super well, especially when the leather's wet and pliable like this. And then we're just going to take the box cutter, and this cut doesn't have to be pretty because it's going to get trimmed flush to its backer piece later. So we're just going to kind of roughly cut this out. And we're going to lay our knife down here. And we're gonna bust this straight edge up against that mark and push this down around it. And the trick is make sure your fingernails are trimmed so that you don't scratch up the leather, because you can see with my nail, I can really scuff that up. Let's see, is that, you can really scuff it up pretty bad. So you have to be careful of that. But you're just gonna take, I'll grab the hide sort of like this between the knuckles and then push it down and stretch it. And as you pull on it and force it down, it'll mold around your piece. And the more you kind of stretch as you push, the less likely you are to get wrinkles and things in your piece. So, and this is one of those processes that you just kind of have to work at kind of slowly but surely until you get it where you want it. I'm gonna get that to a point where I'm fairly happy with its mold around the piece. And then I'm gonna let it sit for about 15 minutes and then come back and repeat that.
Jonah, what's the tool you're using now?
This is a wooden burnisher. So this is used primarily for slicking down edges and smoothing them out. So you'll take these curved slots here and run them along the edge of your leather once you've wet and beveled it. And I'll show that in a bit. But I also tend to use this end as kind of a molding tool. You can use sculpting tools if you have those. I've seen people use blunted screwdrivers, all sorts of things. A lot of people get by with just their fingers, but I tend to like something a little longer and thinner because I have pretty beefy hands, so it can be hard to get into little crannies. But all right, so I'm pretty happy with where that's at for now. So I'm gonna set this aside and we're gonna come back to that in about 15 minutes. And we're just gonna do all of that again and then let it sit for another 15 minutes. And we'll probably do that 3 times total. So I'm gonna set a timer so I don't forget.
Do you always leave the object underneath
I
when
do,
you're letting it dry?
mostly just so I can keep things together. I'm actually gonna have to take it back in a minute to use it for cutting. But like when I'm molding something that I don't need for cutting, it's, if I don't need to use the tool for cutting, then I usually do. Mostly out of habit when you're working with something a little thicker, like 4 to 5 and up, and you've let it dry for 5, 10, going up to 15 minutes before you start. It's not super crucial. If you're wet molding like some super thin 2 to 3 ounce, then yeah, I would definitely, just because it doesn't quite have the body to keep itself up and it's a lot more likely to droop. But now we can work on cutting out the back for that. And the reason these pockets have to have a backing piece out of veg as well as the front is because the chrome tan leather of the body can react with the tools and cause them to rust and stuff. It's not a huge concern, especially with tools like this that I'm going to be constantly pulling out and using. They won't be sitting in there for super long periods, but just to be safe. So I'm going to take this again, and this time I'm going to repeat the basic process for cutting out the piece we molded, but I'm going to keep a bit of a tighter tolerance. So this time I'm going to go out 1/2 inch, and that's probably a little bit more than I need to, but we're just being extra precautious. Now, this is actually a heavier piece. This is 10-ounce leather, and this is a bit drier. The thicker veg tan leather tends to get, the drier it tends to be, which makes it a little harder to cut, and it makes it a lot more durable and rugged. So that's why you see lots of different kind of variations of veg tan, like harness leather or saddle skirting. They have different waxes and oils put into the leather during the tanning process to make it more supple and keep it from losing all of that moisture. So like if I were making a belt, I probably wouldn't use this stuff. I would use something like a harness leather that's just pumped full of waxes and tallows, because it's going to be a lot more supple. So it's going to form around you better. It'll get you a better fit. It's also just going to be more comfortable because it's going to be more able to kind of stretch with you and bend around you and things like that. But this, I actually want it to be fairly sturdy and rigid. So I'm going with just a plain 10-ounce veg tan. This veg tan, natural veg tan like this, technically comes in 2 varieties. You'll see tooling leather and strapping leather. It really doesn't matter at all. They're basically the same thing. Strapping leather is going to have a little bit more wax or oil in it, but not much that I've ever really noticed a difference. So if you're just kind of making, one-off projects or just kind of doing things for you, I would just go with a tooling hide because they tend to be on sale at Tandy for dirt cheap on a pretty regular basis. The only time I would really suggest buying specific strapping natural veg, I would honestly say you should probably go for something like harness leather instead. So it's really, I don't see much benefit to it, but some people do. Like if you're going to be batching out a whole bunch of belts and you know that the whole hide is only going to get used for belts, then it might be worth it. But I've never been in a situation where I've wished that I had bought strapping leather instead of tooling leather. So next what we're going to do is on our throat here for this pocket, we're going to use an edge beveler this is a Craft Tool Pro edge beveler, I believe, from Tandy. This is a number 3. The numbering systems for these are honestly the most infuriating part of working with leather because every company has their own that are nowhere near consistent. So a 3 from Tandy is like a 5 from Weaver and like a 10 from some of the designer brands. It's really inconsistent and frustrating. So if you're going to get bevelers, honestly, if you're getting any tools, I would try to go in person to a Tandy store with a project in mind and ask them, hey, which tools do I need for this project? They'll, at least the one out in Norcross, they're very good about not trying to sell you stuff you don't need. They're very upfront and honest about, yeah, don't buy that. That's dumb. I don't know why we sell that. Don't buy it. So if you go in with a specific project in mind, they'll get you what you need for as cheap as they can get it to you, which is nice. And they'll be able to help you, specifically with, well, I want to do lacing, but I don't know what to do for all that. And for things like sizing, which are a pain to figure out online. So I'm going to take this and hold it at about a 45-degree angle. And I'm going to put a little bit of pressure back this way into the piece. Not a lot so that I'm marking the leather, but just enough to kind of keep it nice and settled on there. And what it's going to do is it's going to slice a little bit off the edge. I'm not sure how well this will come off on camera, but you can see here the edge is super square. It's just a flat edge. And then I'm not sure if this will really show well, but here there's just a slight bevel on the top. And then we're going to do that again on the back side. So the smooth side is called your top grain, and then this is called your skive or your flesh side. People use them both. I don't really know why. But we're going to do the same on the skive. And then you have this nice sort of domed, it's not really showing up super well. But what that does is it basically just knocks the corners off of the edge. So then when you take some water and run your slicker over it, that edge will get nice and smooth, and you'll get like a super glassy, smooth edge. And that's honestly a beveler and a burnisher. If you're doing anything with veg tan, should be the first two tools you buy. The beveler should be based on whatever project you're doing and thickness of leather. But these two tools will single-handedly take a janky, like super just bootstrapped project from looking super janky and bootstrapped to looking actually pretty professional. Nothing ruins a leather project's look like an unfinished edge. So now that that's beveled, we're not going to burnish it quite yet. We're going to come back to that. But we're going to come back to our sheath here, and we're just going to work that down a little bit more. Make sure we're keeping everything nice and tight to edges. The trick if you're wet molding any sort of sheath like this, especially for things like knives or other things, it's less of an issue with holsters because of the shape of a gun. But when you're wet molding a sheath like this, the trick is you want your throat, this top edge here, to be just past the widest point of your piece. So if you can see, like right here-ish is where the knife starts to curve back and slim up. So that's right about where I want the throat to be. And the reason that you put it there instead of lower is that way you'll get, your sheath will kind of wrap around it and hold it in place. But the leather should still have enough kind of flexibility and movement in it that you can still get it out without it being too hard. If you went too far up, then your holster or your sheath would have too much purchase and you'd never get it back out. But if you go just past that sort of swell, then it'll hold it nice and secure, and you can dangle your sheath upside down and it won't pop out, but you'll still be able to pull it out without too much effort. And it usually starts out pretty stiff. And every time I make a sheath at first, I always think, oh, good Lord, I have absolutely ruined this project. That's unfortunate. But you just have to kind of push it in and out in a couple times and kind of work it in, and it'll loosen up over time a little bit, which is one of my favorite things about veg tan compared to chrome tan is it ages beautifully, especially natural veg tan as it picks up, waxes and oils from your hands and clothes, and as it reacts with sunlight, it actually tans just like people do. So as it gets left in the sun, it darkens up and turns this beautiful golden brown patina. As it picks up oils and waxes, it picks up that patina even more, and it just like develops its own character and just becomes absolutely beautiful. Chrome tan, if you put it out in the elements for too long, or if you're a little too aggressive with it, it won't. It'll tear eventually and wear out. which is what you see in most leather clothes and jackets that get refurbished, is the chrome tan gave out. But let's see, that's good for now. So now let's move on to making this chest pocket. That's what we're gonna do next. With the pockets, it really just depends on what you want to use the apron for. Like if you're doing carpentry, look online and see what other people put on, like carpentry aprons or blacksmithing aprons. Think about what tools you use the most and what you want to keep on your body. I have these 4 tools that I keep in this chest slot: my beveler, burnisher, edge groover, and scratch awl. 90% of my projects use them and only them. And they can get just about everything done. So that's why they're up on the chest. They're right where I can get to them quick and easy. And the big reason that I made the apron and put them on here is because they were constantly out on the bench, and I would be working and they would be out on the bench getting in the way, and then something would get put on top of them and I wouldn't be able to find them. So this way I'm keeping everything I use on me. And the stuff that I don't use as often when I'm at my shop at home, I have pegboard up behind the bench that I can put some of the stuff that I don't use quite as often on to keep it up off the bench. So that's the kind of thing you want to think about when you're figuring out your pockets. I'll do my best to walk you through how I figure out like spacing and things, but it's really going to vary based on, what you're trying to work with. Like something like a carpenter square or speed square, that pocket isn't going to need as much, wiggle room in it as something like this round burnisher would use, because it has almost no thickness. So that's the sort of thing that you just kind of have to play with and kind of figure out based on messing it up. There's really no better way to figure that out. The best piece of advice I can give on messing it up to figure it out cheaply is getting like craft foam at like Joann's or Michael's. You can get the sheets of like 2mm craft foam. They'll behave fairly similarly to a 2 to 3 ounce, even going up into the 4 to 5 ounce. You can heat them to sort of simulate wet forming, just to get you at least a little bit of an idea of tolerances and how much extra you need. So that's kind of a super cheap alternative that you can use to kind of guess and play with things and figure it out. But there's really no way to figure a lot of it out other than doing it wrong and trying to figure out how you did it wrong. So
Jordan, can I ask you about the apron you're wearing? How much leather, and what's the cost of the leather that went into it?
So for the body of the leather, I went with some relatively cheap garment leather. I got a whole hide for I think $110, and I can easily get 2 out of it if I really wanted to be super stingy and spend an hour trying to fit the patterns in. I could maybe get 3 if I really worked at it. But then there's still like a good bit of scrap left over for doing other projects with. So I'd say probably somewhere between 30 and 40 for the main body. And then for the pockets, I used a whole bunch of veg scrap that I had. So I really can't give you a super sure number on that. But Tandy has lots of great sales. They like a double shoulder of natural veg tan is almost always on sale for like $40. If you I'm using different weights of leather here, mostly because it's what I have around. You could get away with getting a 4 to 5 ounce double shoulder for $35 on sale, and that'll get you all of these pockets and have plenty to do other projects with.
Got
it. It won't necessarily be the nicest veg tan you can get, but it doesn't really need to be because this is meant to get kind of beat up and used and abused. If you're
Physically
doing,
under $100.
yeah, yeah, easily. Now you're gonna, if you want to count, you know, how much time you put into it, then it probably gets a good bit higher. But yeah, so it's the unfortunate thing is a lot of leather can't really be bought in small quantities. Like it's really hard to say, well, I need 3 square feet of leather, so I'm gonna go buy 3 square feet of leather. It's not like fabric in that way. You kind of are stuck with buying half a cow. So, and they have a couple different sizes, but it's not a huge variety. So, you know, I probably put $100 worth of leather into this, but I probably spent close to 250, 300 on leather. But I'm in a position where since I do a lot of this, I'm able to spread that cost out into other things. The nice thing, there's an awesome guy here in Atlanta called, I think it's District Leather Supply. He's just outside Atlanta, I think on 400. He has a website. I'll make sure I include his website in the links I send out. He's by far the best selection I've seen of different sizes. So he started out as just a leather worker, just like me, and he was kind of irritated that like he kept having to buy half a cow for a project that he needed 2 square feet for. So most of what he does is actually buying in bulk these huge hides and then cutting them down into all sorts of different panels for people. Tandy and Weaver will sell you a project panel of like 1 or 2 foot by 2 to 4 foot ish of really nice Herman Oak veg tan. Each one of those is going to cost you $40. At that point, you might as well just buy the double shoulder of the cheaper stuff. You're going to be less worried to mess it up because it's cheaper. You're going to have more room to mess with it and kind of play around. If you're looking to start with like smaller things like jewelry, or you want to start with just kind of some small things to kind of build up a skill base where you're not putting in $100 worth of leather, you can buy a veg tan belly from Tandy for probably $30. And it's not going to be as much leather, but it'll be nice thin stuff. So that's great for small things, like if you want to do earrings or a wallet, and that's dirt cheap. The interesting thing about leather is thicker leather tends to be cheaper up to a certain point because, you know, it comes off the cow in a certain thickness. So when they're giving you only 2 to 3 ounces, they had to cut a whole bunch of leather off that they just had to kind of throw away. So there's an added cost in there, which is kind of counterintuitive. So that like a nice 2 to 3 ounce piece of leather for like a double shoulder or a side, easily $150, $200. But you can get a belly, which is probably 5 square feet ish, for $30. The only caveat is it's almost always in really weird shapes, and so it's not like a solid 2 to 3 square feet, but that's less of a concern if you're doing like earrings or bracelets or something like that. Alrighty.
Thank you.
So, yeah, of course. So, oops, I have to go grab the thinner leather from over on the other table, but I'll explain this pattern really quick. So this is our backing pattern for the chest pocket. It's just a square. You'll see I have all my patterns labeled on the back in black Sharpie. So we're going to cut one of these. This is just the big square that it's on. And what that is actually doing is creating a pocket behind it for, like, I usually just toss my phone in there for listening to music, or if I'm calling somebody when I'm in the workshop, or it's nice for pencils and things. And so that's just kind of a backer that creates a hidden pocket behind it. Then we have this piece that gets laid on top of it that we're also only sewing down this side, and the bottom, which creates a second pocket there, which I really just kind of put a second pocket there because I could. It's really not necessary. But then these oblongs here, these ovals, Those are going to feed this leather strap here, a 1-inch rectangle that we're going to thread through those that make loops to hold these tools. This, I've really only ever seen something like that done on gun belts for bullets or for holding leather working tools. I've never really seen a carpenter or a blacksmith do something like that. And that's probably, I don't really know why no one else really does it, but that's something I've really only seen us leather workers do. So this part is pretty unique to the tools that I'm using. It's sized to the tools I'm using, but the general idea can be pretty easily scaled up or down. If you want to, if you have a set of small chisels or small gouges, if you're doing, wood carving work, you can do something like this. I've seen people use this concept to make French cleat tool holders for things like chisels, smaller chisels where the blade is the same width or smaller than the handle. It won't work for like a 2-inch chisel, but this idea is pretty versatile, but it can be kind of tricky. So the spacing here is I decided that I believe I wanted about 1.5 inches width for each of these tools. That's the nice thing about all of these Craft Tool Pro tools is the groover and the beveler here. Almost all of their handles are the exact same handle. And then they just kind of put a different bit in the end of the handle. So I decided on a 1.5 inch spacing. And then I marked out that 1.5 inches and just put a 1-inch oblong hole on either side of that 1.5 inch mark. And the reason there's 2 here is because I'm going to have my strap loop around. I'm going to take this apron off so I can show you on the apron a little bit better. So I'm going to have this loop here. Let's see if we can fold this to show. So I have this loop here stitched down on this edge. Then it goes in through the first oblong, out through the one right next to it, up and makes a loop. If you're doing like a gun belt for like, say, shotgun shells, this is the way you want to do it. If you're doing like a gun belt for smaller, like 22s, typically guys that do that will just punch one oblong and they'll just thread the loop up and push the bullet in. So that's something you can kind of play with to decide how you want to go with it. You can save yourself some time. But I went with the 2 just to give a little more separation, and it felt a little more stable for me. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go grab that thinner leather really quick, and we'll cut that out.
Kathy, you want to split a cow with me?
All right. Did I hear somebody ask a question?
I was asking Kathy if she wanted to split a cow, but she's muted.
Right.
I was thinking, we should just start from the beginning and, get the butcher to take the meat and then, we split that part of the cow and then we just keep going from.
I'm so glad you didn't say we should raise a calf.
That would be fun, but that's actually how most leather gets made. Almost all leather that is available to buy is a byproduct of the meat industry. Now that story changes a little bit when you get into more specialty things like sheepskin or like deer skin, because there isn't like a large meat packing industry that's packing venison. But almost all cowhide and almost all pig skin that is available for purchase is essentially recycled from the meatpacking industry. So that's kind of, a big part of my brand for my business is all about the sustainability of it. So that's kind of how I answer that question of how do I justify killing animals like that.
Yep.
So it is taking stuff that a meatpacking plant would just throw away and, trying to do something with it. Most of it, an overwhelming majority of leather tan today is chrome tan because it's tanned for things like jackets and bags and things. So veg tan is a lot less common and a lot less people make it. There's really two big manufacturers or tanneries that make veg tan at the moment: Wickett and Craig and Herman Oak. They're the two sort of big names that produce most of the veg tan on the market. Herman Oak is known for being ridiculously high quality, finer stuff. They do, they pretty much stick to natural veg tan as far as I can see, as far as I've seen, but they do a ridiculously good job at it. Wickett and Craig is a lot more adventurous, and that they do harness leather and they do bridle and all sorts of stuff like that. So they do a lot more variations of veg, and they don't do as much natural veg, as far as I can tell. So it's very strange how the leather industry is very like, you have your thing, I have my thing, you stay in your lane, I'll stay in my lane, and then we'll all get along. But those are kind of the big names. There's some small independent tanneries around, but they're pretty much all going out of business because it's getting to the point where there aren't really enough people working with leather to sustain that many small tanneries. So everyone's kind of having to buy from Tandy or Weaver, which really only buy from Wickett and Craig and Herman Oak, because they're the only people that can meet their level of demand, which is kind of sad because there's, I think last year there used to be a tannery up in Stone Mountain, and it finally went out of business. And you could tell when prices went up at Tandy. So it's kind of hurting people on the ground like us a little bit, but there's not much we can really do. So what we're gonna do for cutting out these pieces, normally at home I have a couple big washers that I use as pattern weights. It's not totally necessary, but I usually do it. But I'm just gonna lay this down on my piece, and I'm gonna take the scratch awl, which, see, this is why I normally wear the apron. What did I do with my scratch awl? Oh, here it is in the apron. Okay, so I'm gonna take my scratch awl here. I'm gonna hold this piece down. I'm gonna do my best to get it kind of as close to edges as I can, just to make sure I'm maximizing what leather I have. And when I'm doing something simple like this, that's just a square or a rectangle, I'm not gonna go around and mark the whole thing, because A, it takes up a lot of time, especially when I'm batching things out, but also paper patterns like this aren't really that sturdy, and so they tend to bend, and then my lines are wonky. So I actually just mark the corners of my piece, which also helps make it a little easier to keep it from moving around. But I'll just take the scratch awl and mark my corners. And then what I'll do is I'll go back in with the ruler or the square, and I'll just use my straight edge to connect the dots, essentially, to cut that out. So now I have that marked, and I just have to be careful when I'm marking my next piece to make sure I'm not inside of that. So I'm gonna kind of go to the other side of my hide. And this is a bit wonkier of a shape, but I'm still just gonna do that same thing of just marking my corners because it's all straight lines. The only time I ever really trace out an entire piece to cut is if it's really small and I have like a balsa wood pattern that's thicker and more rigid, and it's not really much extra effort, so I just do it. Or if I'm working with like a curve, it's really the only time I'll actually mark the whole thing. And then I'm also gonna go in and make sure that I mark the ends of my oblong so that I know where to put those. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my box cutter here and I'm going to just super kind of rough cut the piece. I'm not going to go up to my edge. I just want to separate it from the hide just to make it more manageable for when I cut it out for real. Now I can roll this up. And with veg tan, whenever you put it away to store it, you always roll it with the top grain on the inside. And the reason is you can really see here what I was talking about with it darkens when it's exposed to sunlight. So this is where this piece kind of flopped open in the garage and it was sitting in the sun and the rest of it wasn't. So you roll it with, you can even see it, it really shows through on the Skype too. So you roll it with the top grain on the inside to keep that from happening. Not so much because you don't want it to happen, a lot of times you do, but you want to make sure that it happens in a controlled way where it's even, so that when you go to, especially if you're going to be dyeing a piece, you don't want that to be super uneven because then your dye will be uneven and it'll look splotchy and kind of crusty. So you roll it with the Skype on the inside, and most people store their leather in like the big storage, like, 20-gallon tubs, just to make sure that it's not exposed to any light. I don't really go that far, mostly because I don't really have room in the shop for that. But a lot of the more traditional old school leather workers will keep it in tubs like that, or they'll have a whole room in their shop, when they're working out of a big old barn. They'll have a whole room that's totally blacked out that has like a non-UV light in it that they only turn on when they're getting a hide, and it's got black curtains to make sure nothing gets in. I honestly just don't really care that much. Most of my pieces are meant to look kind of rustic and lived in when they get to you anyway. So I'm not a super stickler about it. I avoid it if I can, but if it happens, it happens. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking this big old steel square and using that as a straight edge to cut out my pieces. You can use a ruler if your piece is small enough for that, but this is just kind of what I have here, so I'm using it. The one trick with any straight edge you use for leather, and honestly I would suggest it for anything, is to put non-slip tape on the back, because it will save you quite a lot of headache. I haven't done it on this one because this has this weird Plastidip like coating on it that I've found to do a pretty decent job of keeping it from sliding around too much. But if you have like just a standard metal ruler, especially if it isn't cork backed, I'll get some like grip, like some hockey tape or something like that, and lay it on the back, just to help save you some headache. Righty. The other thing you have to be careful about when you're cutting leather is you have to keep your blade razor sharp. I switched mine out right before we started the call, but I switch out the blade in my box cutter every day when I get in the shop before I start working. And that's why I like the box cutter over something like a more traditional head knife or a round knife, because I don't have to sit there for an hour every day and sharpen it in this weird shape that's a pain to keep flat on a whetstone. I can just unscrew it and put a new one in. A lot of old school leather workers would call me a monster and say that I'm blasphemous for such a thing, but it's one of those things where it's really more about what makes it simple in cutting time. You know, I'm able to produce something for $30 that if they had to sit there and sharpen for an hour, they couldn't get to you for less than 100. So, you know, I feel like I'm winning. They would disagree, but such is this craft. So I'm just doing the same thing as I did on that last one, lining up my steel square here and being careful. When you move up to thicker weights of leather, like I notice it the second I get into a 10-ounce hide. I think 6 to 8 ounce is still pretty fine and usable, but once you hit 10, it starts to become a pain. The leather is so dry and so dense and heavy that it is a monster to cut and just will destroy an edge on your knife. So the trick for that is just like if you're using a box cutter to cut through like balsa, take light passes, never be afraid to cut the same line 3 times. It sounds counterintuitive, but you're almost guaranteed to get a cleaner cut. So I would, once you get up to 10 ounce, I always lay my straight edge and I treat it almost like I'm cutting foam core. I take a pass to just score it, kind of break the skin of the leather. And I'll take another to get through a little more of the meat, and I'll just kind of lightly work on it until I get in. The key is you want to focus more on control and not care about pressure. Let the blade handle that part. Just focus on keeping it controlled and up against your edge. Anybody that works with wood can probably affirm that if you try to force like a marking knife into a piece that doesn't want to let it cut it, you're more likely to skip up over your straight edge and slice your finger open. So that's usually something we want to avoid. So just take your time and go nice and steady with it. So now that we have that cut out, the next thing we have to do is punch those slots. So what I have here is a block of granite. I believe I bought this from Weaver for like $15. I think it's like 8 inches, an 8-inch square probably. But you can honestly go to any plumbing or anywhere that sells countertops, and you can just get a granite sample that's, you know, a couple inches squared, and that'll work. A lot of people that do it professionally and make good money doing it will have like a big 1.5 by 1.5 square that's like permanently mounted on their massive workbench. But I don't have a massive workbench, so I have to move it to work. So this works perfect for me. And, you know, I never have to punch a hole that's more than, you know, 1/8 of an inch wide. So I don't need, you know, a 1.5 foot. But then on top of that, I just have a super cheap cutting board from Walmart that somehow broke. I don't know what happened there. I came into the shop one morning and it had like split, and that was interesting. But now it's like the perfect size, so I just kind of roll with it. But this way, when I punch into my leather, my tool won't just get absolutely destroyed by the granite. The granite is there so that you have a nice solid surface to punch against. It doesn't necessarily always feel like it, but something like a wooden top on a bench will kind of vibrate and bend a little bit out of the way, and that will take a pretty decent amount of force out of your hit when you're hammering a punch through. So that granite doesn't totally get rid of that, but it helps kind of mitigate that loss. So I'm just going to set my piece on top here. And I'm going to take this guy here. This is a mini punch set, also from Tandy. I would honestly buy every tool you can from Tandy because their tools are cheaper. Leather, I would lean a little bit more towards Weaver Leather Craft Supply, especially once you know what you're looking for and you don't have to ask somebody. They're all online. Their stuff's a little more expensive, but it's a lot better in my experience. And Tandy's online service is like straight out of the late 90s. I don't think they've ever really updated their website. So Weaver kills the online game. Tandy dominates the in-person retail. And that's really the only major difference. Most of them carry this, they carry mostly the same hides. They just have their own, store brands of tools, but most of the leather's the same stuff. So it really just depends which kind of experience you want, if you want to be in person or online. But Tandy's tools are cheaper and they work fine. So I'd go with them. It's a lot of leather workers have like $100 punches, and I think that's ridiculous. So just this is a mini punch set. It comes with a couple different heads that you can screw on and off, the black head there. So this is, I believe, an 1/8 inch. That's what we're going to be using. I'm going to do my best to get this visible here. And we're just going to take, you can use a rubber mallet if that's what you have. I'm going to take this like plastic poly mallet, also from Tandy. And just like when you're using like chisels in the wood shop, you don't want to use a metal hammer on a metal tool because you'll just mess them both up. So this just, solves that issue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my punch and I'm going to line it up with the marks I made from my pattern for the ends of the oblong. And I'm literally just going to knock that through. That can take a lot more hits if you get up to thicker leather, but this is pretty thin, so it's going pretty easy. And you can buy oblong punches, and I have a cheap set from Amazon, but I forgot them. So we're doing this way. This is, honestly, I wouldn't buy an oblong punch until you know that you're going to be doing a whole lot of belts and straps and things. I would start with just a mini punch set because it's a really easy way that you can make any sort of oblong, any width or length that you need, instead of being kind of stuck with the one punch that you could afford. So I'm going through and punching a hole at each end. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my straight edge of my box cutter and essentially connect the dots.
So now, what's the size of this punch?
I believe this is the 1/8 inch.
Okay.
Yeah. But so you can buy like one size drive punches that are just a single punch. Don't is kind of my advice. It's fine once you've kind of hit your stride with leather and you know the kinds of things you're going to be making and you know like the 2 or 3 sizes that you need and you can afford to spend $80 on one punch. But where an 1/8 inch drive punch from Tandy or Weaver would be at least $50, probably closer to $80. This mini punch set was like $30 and I have like 6 sizes. So I really don't see why anyone would really make that choice. Yep. The only real advantage is if you have a bunch of set punches, you don't have to like switch out the head if you're using multiple sizes on a project. But I'd rather spend 30 seconds screwing something than, an extra couple $100 to get those same sizes. So. Another trick, if you're cutting through something thicker that's being a lot more stubborn, your punch will have a tendency to kind of get stuck once you punch through. A lot of times the leather will have really good grip and won't really want to let you pull it back out easy. The best way I've found to eliminate that is to take like a stick of beeswax and just rub some beeswax on your head, on the head of the punch. And that just kind of works as a lubricant. So it makes it easier to get through in the first place and infinitely easier to get back out.
Jonah, this is 4 ounce leather? Is that right?
Yeah, this is a 3 to 4 ounce leather.
Okay.
So the way leather works is it's not super consistent in that way, if that makes sense. So the way it'll come in like a 1 to 2 ounce hide or a 2 to 3 or 3 to 4. basically everywhere else in the world just measures it in millimeters, which, kind of as per usual makes infinitely more sense. I don't know why we're using weight to measure thickness, but we are. So
And it's 4 ounces for what area?
You said 4 ounces with like which piece of the hide?
Well, so when they call it 4 ounces, that's the weight of what area of leather?
That's a very good question. I have no idea.
Is
I
it
don't
like a
think
square
anybody
foot?
has any idea. It's at this point, I think it might have originated as a weight per however much area. At this point, it's literally like this weight equals this thickness. So I don't know
In the
why.
States, at sea level.
Yeah, so I don't know why we don't just start. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Sorry, I'm getting your presentation off track. I apologize.
Yeah, no, it's totally fine. I love answering questions. Yeah, I really don't know why we don't just use metric like the rest of the world. But
Because this is America.
yeah, yeah. But it's literally, if you look on a website, they literally explain 3 to 4 ounces, this equals this thickness.
Got it.
And you'll get the thicker a hide you get or a heavier weight you get, the wider that range will be. So like when you're at 2 to 3 ounces, 3 to 4, up to like an 8 to 10, it stays at like a 2 ounce variance roughly. Once you get up past 10, it starts to go to 11 to 14, and then it goes to, I think the next standard is like 15 to 20. So it starts to get infinitely less consistent as you go up. And the reason for that is the thicker you get, the less room they have to skive stuff off to make it even. So saddle leather people use for saddle making, can be as thick as 30 something ounces.
Jeez.
And sometimes I've seen some people get super consistent thicknesses at that weight. Most of the time it'll be like over here it's 36 ounces and over there it's 30 ounces. And in the middle, for some reason, it's 28 ounces. And that's when you have to start thinking about where in the hide you're putting pieces. When you're at something like a 2 to 3 ounce, or really anything under like 15 ounces, it really doesn't matter a whole lot.
But for this project, you're using everything that's 3 to 4?
Yeah, for the most part. For the box cutter sheath, I'm using 4 to 5 for the piece that we molded, and then I'm using 10 ounce for the backing, just because that's kind of what I had around, so I figured I'd use it. For the strapping for the apron, we're also going to be doing 10 ounce, because that's what I had. That was, you can't really use a strap cutter on anything lighter than that. It doesn't really have enough body, but I'll show that in a minute. How are we doing on time? Oh boy, it's been an hour. Okay, so
I'll stop talking.
no, you're fine. So we're just gonna take our box cutter here, and oh, that's unfortunate. We got to be really careful to not do exactly what I just did. I'm gonna move this so you can see me mess up. You got to be really careful to not cut straight through the other hole, which I just did because I wasn't paying attention. So normally I would probably restart this piece, but I'm really just kind of doing this for demonstration purposes anyway. So I'll just kind of leave it that way for now. But you just want to take your straight edge and line it up with the outside edge of your holes. The trick is always have your straight edge protecting your piece so that your blade is on the outside of the cut. In this case, that's a little counterintuitive because your outside of the cut is actually the inside of the oblong. But the reason you want to do that is that way if your blade wanders away from the straight edge, it'll wander away from the piece and not into it and ruin it. Now the trick to avoid cutting straight through the opposite hole like I just did, is to not cut all the way to it at all, and to just cut to kind of just past the middle, and then flip it around and cut and meet it from the other side. You can see here, it's a lot easier on something this thin, where your blade just glides through it, but that's the big old slice I just put in there that I didn't want. So that's kind of what you want to avoid by going into the middle from each side. Now, this is one of those places, this is like a prime example of what I usually tell people that ask about, you know, should I go for the nice tools or not? Leather is a great hobby for beginners in that nicer tools will in no way make you better. You can get beautiful stuff with the cheapest, jankiest tools. It'll just take longer, but it's very much dependent on how much time and care you're willing to put into making sure it comes out well. Like an oblong punch might make this a little cleaner. It would definitely make it a lot faster, but it's not at all necessary. You're not really going to be able to see these holes for the most part anyway. And if you really take your time and are careful with it, you can get an absolutely stunning oblong with just a hole punch and a knife. So that's kind of the advice I usually give is you most likely have a box cutter in your house. And if you don't, they're like $10 on Amazon. Then a couple more $10 tools. You should be able to get every tool you need to make some beautiful stuff for less than $50. If you really work, if you're willing to put more time into things initially until you can afford to get better tools. And part of that is going to be, you know, like cheaper cutting tools. You're going to have to sharpen or replace the blades more often, things like that. But a large part of it is just, you know, instead of having one tool that just does it, boom, done, you might have to use two tools to kind of make the same effect. But, you know, those two tools are also really useful for other things, whereas that one tool can only do that one thing. So. Okay, while I'm cutting these, since this is pretty repetitive and boring, I'm going to start trying to explain the body piece of the apron. That's out of a 3 to 4 ounce chrome tanned piece of garment leather. And that works great for somebody like me, where I'm really just protecting from like spilling dye on myself, which happens way more than I would like to admit. So that works great for me because it's nice and lightweight, so it's not super heavy. So I'm not going to get tired, especially if I'm wearing it out in this ridiculous Atlanta heat at an outdoor, you know, fair or a show in the middle of July. So that's great. And it's super flexible and supple, so it won't restrict my movement hardly at all. But it's really not going to protect me at all from things like blades, especially power tool blades. But I don't have to worry about that. So I'm fine to use something this light. If you're looking, I think it was you, Kathy, that said you were looking for an apron for your wood shop. If you're working for something like a carpenter's apron, the pattern and stuff will be pretty much the same. It's just a matter of, you might want to step up to something a little bit beefier. That'll have a little more body and will like actually, you know, at least slow down a blade before it, you know, slices something necessary.
Yep.
A Weaver, I'll make sure I include this in the links too. Weaver sells a hide called the Apron Split. That's like a 9 to 10 ounce piece of chrome tan leather that's nice and soft and supple. That's the thickest I've ever seen chrome tan leather. It's fairly supple, so it's still not going to restrict your movement too much, but it's got a lot of body behind it. So that's perfect for something like a blacksmith's apron or a carpenter's apron where you need more legitimate physical protection from things. But it's going to be a lot heavier and, it'll tire you out quicker. So I would use that if you really need the protection, but I would stay away from it if you don't need that level of kind of beef and body behind it, because it's heavy. They use that kind of leather they used to, for doing things for like firefighters, for doing parts of their outfits for running into burning buildings. And the new stuff is a lot lighter than that was, and it's still pretty heavy. So that's kind of one of those things that if you need it, it's great. If you don't, I would do everything in your power to kind of stay away from it. Alrighty, so now that we have these two pocket pieces, we have to glue them together, and we're going to do that with contact cement. You can use wood glue. This is Weldwood contact cement. Most people in the trade prefer barge contact cement. There's an argument that it's stronger, but in reality, especially in projects like this, I don't really care or need it to be that much stronger. Because I'm not gluing this to be the permanent bond like if I was doing a woodworking project. This glue is mostly to hold it in place until I can get a stitch down. So I go with the Weldwood because it's cheaper and I can get it locally and it does what I need it to. A lot of people are starting to move to water-based contact cement, which I've been meaning to do for a long time, but I keep forgetting and then realizing that I need contact cement in the middle of a project and running to the Ace that's 2 minutes away, and this is what they have. So this is what I keep using. But the reason people are kind of making that switch is because this stuff, its fumes are bonkers. If you use a lot of it, like barge tends to come in like a quart container. And if you use it in the garage and forget to open the garage door, it'll get you pretty high pretty quickly on accident. And not like a fun high, like a painful high. So a lot of people are starting to move away from it so that they don't have to worry about having a respirator or things like that. This is the only even remotely dangerous chemical that is ever in my shop, except like linseed oil, which is flammable, and that's really the only danger there. And I really need to stop using it because the smell alone is terrible, and then if you're not well ventilated, it gets way worse very quickly. So it's cheap though, so it's what we're using. But the way this works, if you haven't used contact cement before, is it comes in this little jar with a built-in brush into the lid, and you brush it onto both pieces, and then you let it dry for about 5 to 10 minutes, kind of depending on how humid it is. And then you stick them together once it kind of loses its tack, and they are permanently bound for eternity and not coming apart. You can technically get contact cement thinner. I've never seen it work though. So this is great if you're making like a briefcase or like a big bag and you want to add a liner to it, like if you want to put some suede on the inside. If you contact cement suede to like a slightly thicker piece of leather that's actually the body of your bag, they will act as one piece of leather.
Jonah, are
So
you gonna thread the thin piece through it after you've glued it?
I am.
Huh.
Mostly just because, so it's really hard to know the actual sizing for that piece without actually having the tools in front of you.
Oh, I
So I'm
got you.
going ahead and gluing this together, and then the way I'm gonna work the loops together, work out the loops, is I'm actually gonna glue one end down to the outside and then thread it through, cinch it down around all of my tools, and then I'll trim it to length and glue down the
Got
other side and stitch it. And the reason I'm doing this first is just because if I already have those loops on there, it's going to be a lot harder to get cement on this inside. So I'm doing about a 1/4 inch or so wide line of glue around the edge. And I'm using my granite here to get it up off the bench so that I can just brush it right out over the edge and not worry about getting cement on my work surface, which can then get transferred over to the actual face of the leather. The reason you don't want to get it on the face of the leather is it essentially clogs the pores of the leather, and then when you go and stains it, and then when you go to dye it or antique it or whatever, it won't absorb where the glue is, and then you'll get this weird splotch of a different color that looks nasty. Now I just made my #1 classic most favorite mistake and forgot to mark on this piece first where to glue with this piece, so we're just kind of going to use the paper pattern for that. But on this piece I just glued all the way around the 3 edges that are going to get sewn, but on this piece it extends up past that, so we're going to use our paper pattern to mark in how high up the sides we want to go, and we're just going to use our scratch awl again. And I forget if I said this already, so I'm going to say it again just in case. But the reason we use like a scratch awl instead of a pen or something like that is because the scratch awl's mark will kind of disappear once you dye the leather and things like that. Whereas if you use something like a pen, especially Sharpie, if you're not really careful, that will show up in your final piece. Now, if you're doing something where like you want it to show up on camera, for example, then you're kind of stuck using a pen or Sharpie. But in that case, just mark it on the backside. Check the front to make sure there's no like glaring imperfections where you're about to put your piece first. But if you have to use a pen or Sharpie, mark it on the backside where people won't see it. Now, if you're working with something like harness leather or bridle leather or something that comes pre-dyed and finished from the tannery, it won't really take this contact cement very well. Natural Veg does a fairly decent job at it because on the top grain, because there's really no finish applied to it at the tannery. They really leave that open for you to do yourself. But if you get like harness or bridle leather, then it'll have like a kind of glossy, waxy coating on the outside. And your contact cement just won't stick to that. So what you have to do is you can take some sandpaper, you can take, some people have like a specialized rougher tool. That's another one of those tools that I don't get. I don't understand the point of it, but I just take the back of an X-Acto blade and just use that to kind of scrape along and score the leather a little bit, just to kind of rough it up and take off some of that coating, just so the contact cement has something to kind of grip onto. But those have to dry for about 5 minutes. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and cut our body for the piece, for our body for the apron. So we're going to have to readjust a little bit, clear some of this stuff out. So this is our pattern for the body of the apron. I'm not going to give you exact measurements for this because that isn't at all helpful to you actually. But I will explain sort of quickly how to find those measurements for yourself. I have it somewhere, not sure what I did with it, but I just use a fabric tape measure for sewing and things like that, and measure for the height of the piece. I measure from like the divot in my collarbone, right about that's where I kind of like the top of my apron to sit, and measure down to my waist, and then measure from there to just below my knee. That's also super subjective and just sort of up to preference and what you want. So I really recommend taking some big paper like this and making yourself a mock-up and seeing if you like where things sit. This is a roll of butcher paper that I bought from the local Ace like 2 years ago for like $30, and I still am nowhere near finishing it. I love it. This is what I make most of my patterns in because it's a little bit more durable than like copy paper, and I can get big pieces like this. For making this pattern, this is really tricky because it's really big, and making big patterns like this square and symmetrical can be horrible if you don't know what you're doing. It's like terrible to try to just make something like this square. The way to go about it without absolutely hating the process is rough cut a big old piece of paper and fold it in half to make a center line here, and then use a big steel square like this to mark out all of your different dimensions, and then still fold it, working in halves obviously, and then cut it out from there, and then you can unfold it, and it's beautiful and symmetrical and takes barely any time at all and is amazing. In terms of, so for the height of your piece, it's really the most subjective thing ever. For how wide you want your piece to be, that's where I've found sort of a general rule of thumb based on what I've done and what other people have said, is you want to go about 2/3 of your waist measurement for that. So like if you have a 36-inch waist, you would want it to be 24 inches wide. So the way I work out this pattern is I measure from where I want it to sit on my chest, right there at that divot in my collarbone, and I measure down to my waist, and that's how I get this height. And then I figure out how wide I want it to be, cut that in half, and mark out this point. I also use that same fabric measuring tape to figure out how wide I want it to be at the top. I think I did mine 7 inches. I have a pretty ridiculously broad chest, so most people probably don't want it nearly that thick, that wide. But that's just kind of where I decided I liked it. It's really up to you. But I just marked out those 2 points, working in halves, and then connected the dots for here. A lot of people use a French curve to make it a little fancier. I didn't, mostly just because most of the pieces I create in my brand tends to have a little more hard angles and stuff on it, and I want to stay consistent for things like shows. But that's also just personal preference, and I don't have a French curve. That was also part of it. But then once I get these 2 points, I'll measure down from my waist to where I want it to end. That's also super subjective. I like it to end just below my knee, just kind of because that's what I've found I like. And then I measure it out to the same width as this point. The only real differences I have ever seen in terms of this pattern that are like specific to leatherworking or carpentry or woodworking or blacksmithing is blacksmith aprons almost exclusively have a split down the middle starting right at the crotch, going down to the bottom. And from what I've been able to understand, that's so that they can hold things like tongs between their legs, and they can also be using both hands for things. You could also do that if you have thicker leather and want to be able to move a little bit better. It probably makes it a little bit easier to sit down with. I almost never sit in my shop, so I didn't bother. But that's something that you just can kind of play with and decide if you like it or not. But cutting this is actually honestly going to be the hardest part of this project, just because of the leather I'm using. It's really thin, it's really pliable, it's super stretchy, and so that makes it really difficult to cut cleanly. We're just kind of going to have to do our best. But okay, one last thing about this pattern is I've marked out here, I don't know how well you can see, this is just kind of general pattern maintenance tips if you're doing leatherworking. I have like a crosshair essentially where I need to punch all my holes for rivets. Those will be for billets that we'll also cut out in a minute. So I mark each of those with a crosshair. And then if I'm punching the hole, I circle it in black Sharpie. And if I just need to mark it, for example, I have here marked where we're going to lay in that chest pocket. If I just want to mark it and not punch it, I'll circle it in red. If I'm working on a more complex project, like if I'm putting on things like spots or snaps or things like that, or if I'm working with different diameter punches, I keep 4 colors of Sharpie just on a little loop of lace that I loop onto my apron strap. And so black and red are already kind of spoken for, but I use the blue and green kind of on a project to project basis, just to help me look at the pattern and instantly know that that's one thing and that's a different thing, so that I don't accidentally punch somewhere that was just meant to be a mark, because I've done that before, and then that was like a $70 piece of leather that I had to throw away and start over. So that's just one of those things that if you don't do it, it's not a huge deal until it is a huge deal, and then you kind of kick yourself for it. So we're going to do our best here. This is where you'll really be able to tell the difference between veg tan and chrome tan leather. You can see this like folds nice and easy. It's super soft and supple. It folds a lot more like a bolt of fabric would, whereas the veg tan, I could only kind of get it in a sort of loose roll. But this is what this looks like. We're going to have to do some rejiggering. So since this is meant for garments and stuff, this cut is absolutely massive. I've already taken probably a third, if not more, of the length off. And it's still longer than this table, which is unfortunate. Okay, before we cut that, I can tell these pieces are dry, and we don't want them to get too dry, or they'll stop sticking. So I'm just going to lay these in really quick. The way this works is you just take your 2 pieces that have contact cement on them, do your best to line everything up nice and pretty. I always cut my patterns to be bigger than they need to be so that I can trim everything flush, so that when I inevitably mess up cutting something or gluing something, I can just cut that mess up off, and then no one will ever know. But I have this, you can see they're stuck together now. They're not really going to come apart. But just to make sure, I'm going to bring my granite back. I'm going to set this on here. I'm going to take my mallet, and I'm just going to super lightly pat around the edge. And what that does is that just helps me ensure that I have nice full contact all the way around the edge, so I know that the whole thing is nice and stuck, and I don't have like a weird pocket where there's nothing actually stuck together there. So I'm going to set that aside for now, since we already have this all laid out, and do my best to cut it. I have no idea how I'm going to be able to show you this in any sort of meaningful way, but we're going to do our best. Now, this instance with chrome tan, this is where you kind of get stuck using the pen or the Sharpie, because it won't really take an all mark very well. So what we're actually going to do, we're gonna flip this around. This is another one of those things that like old school leather workers get really mad about, putting your top grain down on your work surface. But I don't really have much of an option, so we're just kind of making do. Now, I like to make a lot of rustic pieces, mostly because I enjoy that sort of aesthetic, but also because when I mess things up, it's really easy to pretend that it was supposed to be like that. So it's a great way to start because you can screw all sorts of things up and nobody will ever know. But so if you want to go for like a super rustic look, I've seen some people will butt the edge of their pattern up kind of close to just the sort of torn edge of the actual hide, and then they'll leave that uncut edge at the bottom. I don't really like the way that looks, just because I tend to put a decent bit of work into making sure my cuts are clean and nice, and it looks a little weird to me to have a bunch of relatively clean cuts and then all of a sudden this weird super jagged edge. But that's totally personal preference. Oh wow, this hide is massive. Good lord. So when I first ordered this hide, I thought I would be able to get one apron out of it, and that I was going to have to do this for the first time live on video. And then it showed up at my house, and I realized, oh, I can definitely get two out of that. And now that I'm cutting a second, I'm definitely going to be able to get like four. This is ridiculous. So cut another like $20 off of what I said about the price earlier. But here we have, so we've laid this out as best we can. I'm going to use my granite to kind of weigh this down where I'm marking, just to make that easier. And once again, I'm just going to mark my corners and then kind of connect the dots. But this time, instead of using the scratch awl, which won't really show up, I'm going to have to use the Sharpie. But I'm doing that on the flesh side, so you won't see it. It's going to be up against my body, so I don't really have an issue with that. The one thing you really have to think about, though, when you're working with, when you're marking things with a Sharpie as opposed to an awl, is this line is really thick, whereas an awl is pretty fine. So you have to be a lot more conscious about cutting to the inside of your mark instead of the outside. Because when you have a Sharpie like this, it doesn't really matter too much if you cut to the inside or the outside. But when you have thick lines like this, you just have to be consistent, or else your lines aren't going to be straight. It won't wind up symmetrical. It's going to wind up looking kind of wonky. And it won't necessarily be super immediately recognizable as, oh, that line isn't quite right. But it's just going to, from experience, it's just kind of going to be that thing where you look at it and you're like, something's not right here. What is it right here? And it's going to bug the crap out of you, and you're going to have no idea what you did wrong. And then you're going to cut another one the right way, and you're going to be like, this looks so much better. What on earth did I do? So just sort of pick one and stick with it, as it were. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Now, in this instance, I've actually punched out the holes I need to mark for rivets with a hole punch. Normally, I would advise against that because you can't get like a fine, accurate point, and that makes it a little harder to make sure your punches line up right. But in this case, where I'm marking with a Sharpie and not an awl, I kind of need that larger hole to be able to make sure that it actually makes the mark that I'm looking for. Yeah. Nope, not. There we go. Alrighty. So now I'm going to put this back. Okay, now comes the hard part. Now we're going to take this steel square and we're going to take our box cutter and we're going to cut it out the same way we cut out those pocket pieces. But because this leather is so much more flexible, it has so much more give to it, we have to be a lot more careful about making sure it's not moving around on us, about making sure that it's not stretched weird under our straight edge, so that when we take it off and it, goes back to the way it wants to be, it's got a weird flexible, or like a weird wonky edge. So this is where it really pays to just take your time, cut lightly. This is thin leather that if this was veg tan, I would cut through it in one go. But because it has so much give to it, I'm going to be super light on my cuts. And I'm going to take, 2 or 3 to get through, just to make sure that I don't accidentally just pull the leather instead of cutting it. And that's another thing where it's super important to make sure that your blade is super sharp, because that will help alleviate a good piece of that. Up. It might be a little bit easier to see on this one since it's towards the camera, but here you can see I'm cutting. Well, it doesn't really show up because it's black on black, but I'm making sure that I'm keeping my straight edge on the inside of that Sharpie and making sure that I can see the entire line of Sharpie. Oop. So you can see those light cuts there really pay off here because the leather isn't pulling. It's not trying to stretch wonky and get away from me. It's staying more or less where I want it. Perfect. Okay, so does anybody have any questions they can think of at the moment while I'm just sort of cutting this out?
I think we're good.
Have you ever thought about using like a pizza cutter instead of a box knife?
Yeah, so when you get to super thin stuff like this, there are some people that will use like a Fiskars rotary cutter for sewing. I've seen it work really well for some people. I've tried it. It was, it worked, but this kind of works better for me just because it's sort of more what I'm used to and I've figured out how to make it work. But that's one of those things where that's like totally just me being picky, I guess. It really doesn't matter. You could totally use a rotary cutter. The super traditional method of cutting leather, I don't own one because they're all really expensive. And I'm like, a broke 17-year-old that can't afford a $200 knife. But it's called a round knife or a head knife. And it's essentially like the blade is a big semicircle. And so a head knife is actually more parabola-y. It's not quite an even circle, and then a round knife is a perfect circle. That's really the only difference. But a lot of people use them exactly like a rotary cutter. It's just instead of just being able to push and keep rotating, they have to kind of rock it.
Like an Inuit knife?
Say it again?
Like an Inuit knife with a handle?
Yeah, sort of. Except instead of the handle being relatively parallel to the blade, it's perpendicular.
Is it?
So it's shaped almost like a really wide shovel.
Yeah.
Essentially, just a lot smaller. But it's one of those things where since they're so ridiculously specific to leather, the people that make them are able to charge a ridiculous amount for them. Most of them come out of Japan and use really nice steel and are absolutely beautiful, but then they're, $250.
Yeah.
And so that's one of those things I really, except for like super old school people that are that have been doing this for decades and decades, I've only ever seen somebody use a round knife or a head knife for the purpose of explaining what it is. I've only ever seen people that are like, yeah, I bought it so that I could like show it to you in this video and explain what this is and how it works. I'm never going to use it for real though. Just because they're a pain to sharpen. You have to really work at getting good with them. Once you get good with them, you're going to get amazing results every time. And it's like practically witchcraft as far as I'm concerned. But it takes so long to get good with them. And really the only argument for using them is because, like, it's one of those things that whenever you ask an old school person why they use it, the answer is some form of because I said so. And it's really like there isn't a huge advantage to using it over just a box cutter other than like the sort of status symbol of like I can use a head knife and you can't. So I've never bothered. Now, oftentimes, leather will have sort of inconsistencies in it. And so sometimes you'll be cutting and you'll get all the way through along the entire line. And then for some reason, there will be like a couple patches where it was just a little bit tougher and you didn't quite get it through. Normally, to solve that, I won't bother trying to keep the straight edge there. Once I already have a nice established cut line, it'll follow that, especially on like veg tan that has more body. I'll just kind of pull one end up and stick the blade and kind of pull it just to nick that last little bit there. And you really just kind of have to get the feel for when that's a sign that the tip of your blade is getting dull and when it's the leather just being difficult. But sort of over time, you'll kind of get the feel for I need to replace my blade versus, oh, this leather's just trying to make my life hard today.
Gunnar, if you were making it yourself without us on the video, how long would it take you?
It honestly really depends on the day and how thought through the process was. Leather is like algebra in that it's all about the order of operations and it's all about doing this thing now so that it's dry by the time that thing is done, so that you know, so that like you're not just sitting there waiting on things to dry. When I made my first one as a practice for this, I didn't think that through very well, which was sort of the point so that I could realize what things I needed to do when. And so it took me probably 2 days just because I kept like I cut this piece first and then I was like, oh, now I have to just like sit here for 30 minutes and let stuff dry. I was dumb. I also dyed the natural veg tan pieces on that first one. We're not going to be doing that here, partially because dye has to take a couple hours to dry and because I was going to be rebellious and try to do it anyway and ordered some, but because of the pandemic, everything's taking longer to ship. So I get here in time. So we're just gonna kind of have this weird super light tan piece pieces up against a really dark piece, but it is what it is. So cutting this bottom here, I'm gonna see if I can twist this so you can see it better. This is getting kind of tough because it's the exact same length as my straight edge. And this is when, if I was at my shop, I would actually put this on the floor and grab like a piece of MDF or something with a factory cut edge just to make my life easier. But I wouldn't really be able to show you on the floor, so I'm just gonna kind of make it work. But it's situations like this where it can be really helpful to rough cut a piece. So I'm actually gonna take this. So if you really want to just chew through leather really quickly, the best way I found to do it is to take one side of what you're cutting and kind of pull it up and out a little bit. And then by putting some tension on the leather, your blade will just absolutely glide through it like this. And what that accomplishes is it just makes it quicker if you're just trying to, you're not going to be able to be precise with it to save your life. But it's nice if you're just rough cutting kind of far from your edge, just to separate a piece out quickly to make your life easier. So now what I can do that I've separated is I can flip this around so that it is oriented in a way that makes my life easier and not harder. So that's the other big advice when you're cutting leather, is never be afraid to move your piece and work around it. That's the only real problem I have with my shop at the moment. Is I'm in my garage and my parents still want to be able to pull the cars in every night. So my bench, I have like 4 feet deep by 6.5 feet, I think, of bench. So it's pressed up against the wall all the time. So I can't just, walk around the bench, which can be difficult quite often. So this table is actually wonderful. I want one of these. But that's the sort of thing that I'm sure, Kathy, you can probably attest to with doing all the woodworking, is it's really nice to be able to walk around your bench and get at things from.
Yeah, especially when it's all full of everything else. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Plus, Rusty will tell you, I don't have air conditioning in mine or heat, so.
Oh, me too. I don't even have insulation either.
Yeah.
Terrible. In the summer.
Yeah.
Oh, God, when it's 90 degrees outside.
Yeah.
Oh, my garage is a sauna.
You people are nuts. Get a window unit. Get some insulation.
I have tried on numerous occasions to get my parents to let me tear off because our entire house was done by this lady that it was her first time building a house. She wasn't like had no credentials. She was basically doing it under the table through her brother's firm or whatever.
Jonah, this is being recorded, right?
Yeah. It's way past the statute of limitations at this point. It was built in 2003, I think. But almost all of it was done terribly. And our garage, the sheetrock is falling off. It doesn't reach all the way to the ground. So I've asked on numerous occasions to be allowed to just tear it all off and put in insulation in a mini split. But I keep getting rejected. But now I'm taking my mini punch here. I'm just going to punch out the holes I marked. These are going to wind up being for billets, which is a weird word. I don't know why we say billet, but we do. And that just means a end of a strap. So those are basically just going to be little loops that will hold a couple D-rings that will then use to attach straps to. So the one nice thing about chrome sand like this is it's kind of hard to cut straight lines because it has so much give, but it punches like an absolute dream. So now you can see we have, it's gonna die, okay. So you can see that we have kind of the body all cut out. So
yep.
Hold that and set that aside for a minute. Now we're going to come over. We're going to come back to this sheet for a minute because I forgot to do that earlier. So now you can see it's kind of starting to return back to its original color here. 2 hours honestly isn't really enough time to do this in an ideal way. We're just kind of going to make do though. That's okay. So I'm going to set this here and we're just going to kind of repeat that process again of just trying to work it down a little bit more. And it's a lot like kneading a dough, if any of you bake. You just have to be kind of rough and aggressive with it and not afraid to really work it in. The more you pull and really kind of stretch the leather around, the less likely you are to get things like wrinkles and stuff. Right, that's actually looking pretty good. So now what I think we're going to do is we're going to take our backing piece here, which you'll see lays on pretty nice like that. As you can see, that's essentially what this is going to be.
Yep.
So now we're just going to use that same contact cement from a minute ago and glue this down. And then once that's glued, what we're going to do is we're going to take this knife and just kind of force it in. And that'll kind of finish the wet forming of it.
Gotcha.
If you're using something that you care a little bit more about than like a coated box cutter like this, you can wrap it in packing tape just to keep the moisture off it if you're worried about it, rusting or having problems like that. That's the most common fix I've found. Some people will use saran wrap. That seems like a nightmare to me. I'll just use packing tape. It's just one of those things where just kind of play with it, figure out what works for you. But we're going to come around. We want to mark just a little bit more. We want to mark sort of a rough idea of where we want this to lay, just so we kind of know where to shoot for with the glue. So I'm just kind of going to roughly trace it with the Sharpie onto this bottom piece here, just to sort of get an idea of where I want to shoot for with the glue. So you can see I just kind of have marked out.
Yep.
Then what we want to do is we're just going to repeat that process that we used for those pockets a minute ago. Just brush on some of the glue. I'm going to form this a little bit better real quick. We're just going to brush on some of that glue and then let it dry for 5 minutes or so. While we're waiting for that to dry, we'll work on finishing up that chest pocket. And then we will also, if we have time, let me see what time is it? Oh boy, okay. So we're probably gonna run a bit over, if that's okay with everybody, but.
No, don't worry about time.
Yeah, so we're gonna glue this down, then we'll finish that pocket up. Then we'll probably, while we wait for stuff to dry, I'll show y'all how I do the custom stamp I have here on the top here that has the brand name on it. So, gonna get our contact cement here.
Hey Kathy, there's a wonderful looking apron for sale in leather. It's $425.
Woo!
I'd rather have $425 worth of walnut and get Jonah to help me make my apron.
Yeah, but that's true for everything. You'd rather have walnut.
True.
God forbid you need dialysis. You'd be like, nah, I'd rather have walnut.
Yeah. So I'm just doing the same thing I did of kind of brushing on the cement over the edge. And with this piece, I'm a lot less worried about going too far in because this piece is molded up in a way. So I don't have to worry about accidentally sticking too much of it together and not being able to get it in because there isn't leather on the other side there for it to stick to. When you're doing something like a wallet or, a bag, or like we did with that pouch there, or that pocket, that's something you have to think about, is making sure that you don't put glue too far in, and then, you have enough tolerance for your stitch line for something to be able to fit in, but then, it's accidentally glued down and I can't actually get anything in here. And then you wind up with a fake pocket and questioning life choices. So again, I'm also being kind of quick and dirty with the glue on this end. I'm making sure that I get it a decent ways inside the line of the glue, but I'm not worrying, and I'm also going a little bit outside the line. And the reason I'm going outside the line is when you're gluing edges down, its main purpose is just to ensure that the pieces stay together while you're punching and stitching, but it also serves the purpose of keeping those layers laminated nice and tight together so that when you burnish your edges, they don't kind of separate with time and wind up looking janky, and that'll kind of kill the look of the piece pretty quickly. So by going outside that line, I know when I trim it back to that line, I know that I'll have nice even coverage with the glue, and I won't have to worry about pockets of not having good enough coverage there. So I'm just going to set those aside to dry for a bit, and we're going to come handle this guy. So we have to cut our strap of leather. Now, if we were working with like 10-ounce leather, that would be really easy. I could use if we were working with thicker leather, I could use this guy, a strap cutter, and that would make super quick work of cutting a parallel strap like that. But this thinner stuff that we're going to be using here doesn't have enough body for this. You can't really pull it through very well. It just kind of scrunches up and doesn't work. So instead, what we're going to do is I have a 1-inch wide ruler here, and I want to cut a 1-inch strap. And this makes life so easy because I can just lay out my leather here. I can find a spot where I have enough room to cut a strap. I'm going to get it as close to the edge as I can, just to help minimize scrap and make sure that I'm getting, my money's worth out of the hide. So I'm going to get it as close to that edge as I can. And then I'm just going to cut following one side of that metal ruler. Whoop. Being really careful to make sure your fingers aren't hanging over the edge of the ruler so you don't cut yourself. And then I'm just going to make sure that I hold that in place where it is and do the same thing on the other side. There we go. Now you can see, just by using that ruler as a guide, I have a pretty nice strap there. It's not perfect by any means, but I don't really need it to be. I'm kind of lucky in a sense that I've sort of built my brand on not perfect. So when I mess up a little bit, it's just character and a unique piece. But I'm just gonna I'm gonna do the same thing on here again with the contact cement. But it's gonna be a little bit more kind of herky-jerky, if that makes sense. So I'm gonna brush just a little bit of contact cement on this end here that I just cut relatively flat. And I'm gonna glue it down right in the middle of these oblongs. So I'm gonna do my best to sort of line it up with the oblongs there. And I'm gonna glue it down to this edge of the pocket. Then what I'm gonna do is I'll trim that side to get it all nice and flush and beautiful. Then I'll thread it through all of the loops, put my tools in there, pull this side to make sure it's nice and tight and where I want it fit wise. and then glue this side down. And then I'll cut everything to length, and this pocket will be ready to glue onto the body of the apron. And so this is what I mean when I say leather is really a lot like algebra, in that it's all about kind of trying to do things in the right order. And if you are smart about how you plan your day, you can be really productive and get a lot of things done in a really short amount of time. And if you don't, and you're like me, where you tend to go a little ad hoc and just kind of wing it a lot of the time, you tend to wind up regretting that, because you sit there waiting for dye to dry when you could be, you know, batching out 10 belts or whatever. So, strap here. Now, this is a good example of what I was talking about when I said sometimes you have to be really careful about not putting your glue too far in. Here you can see I only put a fairly thin bead of glue on there, because this has to almost immediately bend up over a tool. So I want to make sure that I only have sort of the bare minimum there glued down.
Jonah, are you going to stitch over it afterwards?
I am, yeah. Now, I probably won't do most of the stitching during the class. I'll probably just do a little bit of it to show you.
All right.
Because it takes a long time.
You stitch by hand, and like you punch holes and then stitch by hand?
Yeah. So I'll get to that probably in like 10 minutes. We'll probably be stitching. So now these have to set aside and dry. So while those are drying, now we're going to work on getting our straps for the apron ready. So on the apron I made already that I showed you, I went with a crossback straps, where one strap comes to this shoulder and then comes to my waist on this side, and then the other crosses over it. Today, I think I'm going to do it a little bit differently, because I don't quite like how that fits. The hardware and all that's going to be the same, and the process is the same. It's just a difference of how long the straps are and where they clip to. But we are going to take, not this guy, this guy. Okay. So we're going to take this big, long piece of leather here, and it's a little hard to see. We're going to kind of do our best. And what we have to do to start is we have to cut a nice straight line for our strap cutter to then follow. The easiest way to do that when you have longer, when you have like a full hide, is a lot of people will just take some like metal bar stock that they buy at the hardware store, clamp that down on top of the leather on their bench, and follow that with their knife. Another way a lot of people will go about that is they'll just butt it up against the edge of their bench that has like a factory or table saw cut edge on plywood or MDF or whatever their surface is. And then they'll weigh the leather down, and they'll actually take their box cutter. If you imagine that this granite here is the edge of their table, they'll come from under it with their box cutter here, assuming it's a lot less thick, and just rest the flat of the blade against their table's edge, and then just draw along it to cut a super straight edge. And I just realized I don't quite have enough in this piece to get the straps, so we won't do full straps. We'll just reuse the ones that I have since they're already natural, but I'll show you how that process works, just to make it a little bit easier. But since I'm going to cut it along this edge here, I can use just my square because it's barely long enough. But the trick, in order to make sure you're getting your money's worth out of your hide and making sure that you're being efficient, is you want to butt it as close to the raw edge as you can. And that way you're just, you're not wasting more than you absolutely have to. Now, a lot of guys that I know that do leatherworking, when they first get a hide, the first thing they'll do is they'll bust a straight edge on one end, and then they'll use their strap cutter to cut out a 2-inch piece, and then they'll run that through a lace cutter and cut a whole bunch of lace. The reason for that is you can buy leather lace like on a spool. You can buy it at Joann's for way more than it's worth. You can buy it from Tandy or Weaver, people like that, on the same spool for way less because they buy more of it. But it only comes in certain colors and certain tannages. So if you're doing like a rustic piece where you want to do lace edging, or edge lacing, but you want that edge lacing to match up, then you can cut your own lace. They have it's essentially like a souped up version of that strap cutter that clamps down to your bench that has a bunch of essentially box cutter blades in it that you can cut thinner straps with to do edge lacing with. But I don't do much lacing, so I hardly ever bother. This is where you can see what I was talking about the 10-ounce stuff being a lot more sort of difficult to cut through. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll score it once or twice just to get kind of an established line. And then I'll put my knife up from the underside and kind of pull it through. And it'll follow that sort of established cut line that I have. And it just tends to work a little bit better. The main reason for that is usually on these box cutters, especially in leather, your tip will get dull, but your tip will be dull, but like down here will still be perfectly sharp because it hasn't really been used. So when I can, I like to kind of try to use as much of the blade as possible. So the way this strap cutter works is it has this cross arm here. If you loosen this kind of bolt, you can adjust this. You can slide this in and out. So come on, there we go. You can adjust this in or out. And it has, I don't know how visible they are, but it has markings here so you can set it to certain lengths. There's a replaceable blade in here. There's slots on this side that you can unscrew these and replace that. And then you can change this thickness here. Right now it's set to when I was cutting some 14-ounce harness leather for most of the stuff that I sell. But so it's thicker than we need, which normally isn't ideal, but it's not a huge problem. So for this guy, I used 1-inch straps. When you say a 1-inch strap to use with 1-inch hardware, you actually want to go just under a 1/16 of an inch less than that. And the main reason is just so that it will actually fit inside, 1-inch hardware. That way you have a little bit of tolerance. So it'll fit and it'll have a little bit of wiggle room so it won't be super stiff. But once you have all this tightened down, you hold this against your straight edge, and the straight edge you just cut will butt against the handle to keep everything nice and parallel. A lot of times it helps if it's being stubborn. You can cut kind of a bit of a slit just to get things started with your knife, just to help get started. But once you have it going here, I pull the piece coming out just a hair to the left away from the handle, and that helps make sure that it stays nice and butted up against the handle there. And you can see now I have a nice strap. This one isn't perfect because there was this weird lump in the leather there that kind of threw it off. But if you ever buy like a leather belt from Target or something that's actual leather, that's probably how it was done. So normally you would do that down the long side of a hide, and you would get 40-something inch straps that you can then break down into smaller pieces. Just to show you then what I do to them to turn them into these straps here. So you can see this is what a burnished edge looks like. I don't know how easy it is to see on camera, but it's a bit darker and it's a lot smoother. It's got kind of a nice rounded, smooth edge. So I beveled everything and burnished everything, just like we're gonna do on the pockets and on all the pockets. And then at the ends here, I wet the bend to make it easier to form around the swivel hook. And then these are just two double cap rivets, or not double cap rivets, tube rivets. You can buy these in bulk from Tandy and Weaver. The way it works is it has a post and it has a cap that you hammer down on top of it. I didn't bring any today. I brought saddle rivets because it's what I had. I think I ran out of the tube rivets. They're a lot more difficult and time consuming to deal with, but we'll kind of make it work. I'll show you how they work once we get there, but that's how you handle the straps. Now, our sheath should be good. Oh yeah. So if you lose track of time and you want to know if your pieces are ready to contact cement, it'll pretty much lost its tack. You'll still feel just a little bit of tack, but it won't be sticky anymore. And you can see it's kind of glossy. That usually means it's good to go. So we're just going to kind of do our best to line up the back with where we kind of roughed in that it belonged. Doing our best to use that kind of traced line to make sure that everything is actually going to where it should be and hasn't, bowed out or anything. So now that that's glued down, we're just going to do the same thing with the mallet and just tamp that down, get everything nice and secure. Now we're going to take our box cutter, slide that in there. You can see that's a really beautiful fit. And then we can still get it out without too much hassle. But if I hold it upside down, it's not going to come out. So that's sort of the beauty of a wet form sheath. So now what we want to do is we're going to take our piece here. And this is going to be kind of difficult to show. But we're going to take our piece, bring it up against the edge, let the molded part sit over the edge of the table. And we're just going to use our back as a guide to cut the front piece. And what that does, so we're essentially using the backing piece as a straight edge. And what that accomplishes is once you get it all cut off, it's going to look like they were perfectly die cut to match each other. And you don't have to worry about trying to make all that stuff match up. It just does. And also don't be afraid to occasionally you'll want to do sort of a paring cut with a knife on things like this to trim it a little bit more flush. You can also always sand your edges a little bit if you take like a 220 grit sandpaper. That'll usually do a pretty good job of getting things nice and flush and smooth. And some people argue that you should actually always sand your edges because fraying them a little bit actually helps with the burnishing process. I don't know how I feel about that, honestly. I've never done it. I haven't really seen much benefit from it, but some people swear by it. So, but there you can see now our edges line up really well there. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take our edge beveler here and we're just going to run it along these edges. Now, this was a little ambitious to try to do wet forming in an online class because in an ideal situation, you would actually want to let it sit for 10 hours or so just to make sure that all the moisture is really gone. And that'll just kind of make things, it'll make beveling and burnishing just a little bit easier and cleaner. But it's at the point now where it's workable. And if you don't want to wait that long, you can always take like a heat gun for paint stripping or even just a hair dryer. to get some of the moisture out. And some people will actually, for making like leather armor, when you soak leather and then it dries out, it becomes stiffer. The quicker that it dries, the more pronounced that hardening effect is. So if you let it air dry, it'll just get kind of stiff and it'll slowly kind of regain its flexibility. With something like, but if you soak it in leather and you form it to a certain shape and then you bake it in the oven at 220 for 20 minutes, it'll be rock hard and it'll stop a knife or a sword or even axes and things. So that's how like traditional medieval armor was made from leather, was you would soak it and then you would bake the moisture out and it would get tough, just like hardening a steel blade. So now what we're going to do is I actually need to fill a container with some water really quickly. I'm going to go grab a little bit of water really quick just so I can show you how the burnishing works, and then we'll sew this onto the apron. Just in case you were curious, this is an example of that harness leather that comes pre-dyed from the factory. So it's almost the same as this veg tan here, but this is about 11 to 14 ounce in thickness, but it's still way more pliable and soft because it has a whole bunch of waxes. I think the term the tanner uses is hot stuffed in. I don't totally understand the science of how that works, but somehow they force a whole bunch of waxes into the leather that make it more pliable. Now for burnishing, what I'm going to do is I have those beveled edges. I'm just going to use my finger here to wet that edge. And I'm just looking for sort of an even discoloration all down the edge. And I'm going to take my burnisher here and I'm going to pick the slot that fits it, that's the right size.
And the burnisher, just a piece of wood with a couple of coves of different sizes?
Yep. And you can get like Dremel bits for burnishing. They sell, like Tandy and Weaver each sell a tool that's essentially just a benchtop grinder with a burnishing wheel on it that has a bunch of different size grooves. So you can mechanize this process, but I honestly don't find that it makes it that much quicker on small projects. It can be really, and it's almost impossible on something like a belt where it's a long, thin strap. So I've never bothered to buy one just because hand burnishing is still fairly quick. So when you're doing this, you're just kind of going back and forth. You don't want to put too much pressure because if you apply too much pressure, what you're going to do is you're going to form like a lip around the outside edge. And that's kind of defeats the whole purpose of making the edge look nice. So what you're going for is actually friction to create heat, and the moisture kind of softens the fibers in the edge and makes them pliable. And then that heat, you're essentially hardening that edge, just like I talked about with the oven. It has something to do with like the collagen and the leather, and somebody has explained the fancy science to me a couple of times. I didn't totally understand. I just kind of took their word for it. But yeah, so that moisture combined with heat lets you really smooth that edge out and get a nice glossy, smooth edge. Now, a lot of times it'll get kind of nasty for a second before it starts to look pretty. This isn't showing up super well, but it'll get sort of cloudy and like grayish. And a lot of times that'll kind of freak people out and they'll give up and say, oh no, it's turning out terrible. But you just kind of got to push through that, and then you'll get this nice, clean, glossy edge. And it really just takes like 30 seconds. And it'll take a project from kind of janky looking to really professional. All right. We're kind of going to go with that's good enough. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this guy, a stitching groover. The way this works is you have this arm here that works as a guide. It butts up against the edge of the piece. And then this bit here cuts a groove in the leather. I usually set mine to right about 1/8 of an inch. Some people do 3/16, some people do 1/4 inch. That's another one of those things that's like purely just kind of preference and aesthetic for how far in or out you go. But I set mine to 1/8 of an inch. And then see if we can get this better in view. So I set mine to 1/8 of an inch. And then you'll see it just cuts a nice groove in the piece like that. And that's going to guide our stitching chisel when we punch our holes to sew this onto the apron with. Perfect. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and glue these pieces together really quickly. And I'm going to show you what I mean for threading this through. So then we're just going to take this guy here. Sometimes it can help to use your scratch awl to kind of help work it through. Come on. There we go. Pull him through. And this is where it helps to have the tools that you want to put in here with you. So I can set this tool in here, set it to right about how high I want it to sit, pull it through. Then I can take my edge beveler and put that in and figure out where I want that to sit. Come on. Now you can kind of see how these loops work. I'll just pull this through. Now this stitching groover is kind of the like arch nemesis of this type of storing tools because of this weird arm. A lot of people I know will pick the width they want to go with and then they'll set it to that and then they'll cut off the rest of this arm here to help alleviate that problem. I really don't know why I haven't done it yet. I keep meaning to and just keep forgetting. So for now, I'm just going to take it out and set it in. And then I can just set that arm in the loop with it, and it's still sufficiently secure. So I'm not spending too much time on this pocket specifically because this is kind of a weirdly specific pocket, and this is really just going to depend on, you know, what tools you want to have. But I'm just going to kind of pull that nice and thick, nice and tight. Make sure everything's where I want it, and then I'm just going to mark with my nail right about where I want that to eventually end. And now I can flip that up, glue along that edge there, and then we can stick that, we'll be able to stick that down and do the same thing we did with the box cutter sheath with the stitching groover and all that. Right. So I'm just going to find where I marked it with my nail, and it just makes the same kind of mark that the scratch awl does. The only reason I didn't use the scratch awl was just because I needed it to be in the slot. I'm going to screw down that there. All right, and now we can just kind of set that aside to dry for a little bit. And now we'll work on punching the holes for sewing this. So once again, we're going to need our granite, and we're going to need a little punching board here. And this is how we punch our holes to sew leather, is these stitching chisels here. So they have prongs that are set at different widths. And you can get all sorts of different sizes. Some of them have diamond tips like this. Some of them are just flat for doing lacing. There's all sorts of different options here, and I haven't really found that it matters which one you go with so much as just personal taste. My only advice is don't pick something that's too fine, that's either too close together, because it'll make sewing take absolutely forever. But the way this works is we're going to use that stitching, that groove as our guide. And that groove actually serves two purposes. First, it serves as a guide so that we know where to punch our holes. But the other thing is once we have that stitching in, it'll kind of lay down in that groove just beneath the surface, and it'll help sort of protect that. But I'm going to lay this in with the first tooth butted up against the edge on the outside. So I'm going to get a good spacing from the edge there. And then I'm just going to hit that through. And I'm going to look to see that I can see and feel the tines all the way across on the back. And then I'm going to push it forward and back to get it out. I don't want to go this way, especially while the weather's wet like this, because it'll mess up the holes and it can mess up the molding and cause all sorts of problems. But then I'm just going to set my last tine, or my first tine, in that last hole again to keep that spacing even. I'm just going to follow this groove around. This is sort of the problem with not quite getting everything as dry as you would like before you start, is sometimes it can be a little wiggly and cause you some issues, but we're just going to make it do. So the biggest way to make sure that it's not too hard to get your tines back out is to make sure that you're only hitting them just far enough. When I first started, I would think that like I had to sink it all the way in to make sure that I had like perfectly even holes all the way through. But you're not actually removing any material with the punch. You're just kind of pushing it to the side out of your way, essentially. So your needle can do just as much of that as this punch can. Now this punch can just take more force to get it started, but you don't have to get the hole perfect all the way through as long as it goes all the way through. And then your needle can kind of spread the hole out a bit as it goes through. Now, when you're coming up to like an end, like this piece or a corner, sometimes you'll have to leave more than just the one in the holes before it. So in that case, I'll just come up to that corner and line it up. So here you can see I have about 3 tines in existing holes. And that's really all there is to it. Sewing is the most repetitive and tedious part of projects like this. I finally just got a leather sewing machine that I will likely use to finish this project with at home. But I'll sew this one on by hand just so I can show you how to do that. Okay. So I went all the way out to my end there, and I realized that my last hole was going to be just a little bit too close to the edge for comfort. So I just backed it up so that I wasn't going all the way out over the edge. Now you can see I have all these holes in here. So I'm going to grab my needles and thread. Oh, good Lord, do I not have needles? Oh, that's deeply unfortunate. Oh boy. Okay. So it looks like I don't actually have needles to sew with, which is unfortunate. But I can do my best to explain it for you so you can see how it'll work. Usually when sewing leather, you're going to use what's called a saddle stitch. And basically what you're doing with that is you have a needle on either end of your thread. You'll cut your thread to be about 4 times the length that you're sewing. Then that varies a little bit depending on how thick the leather is. If you're sewing really thick stuff, obviously you have to increase that. But you'll cut your thread to be 4 times that length. You'll thread a needle on either end. And then you'll start, we'll see if I can do my best to do this really gently just to demonstrate. Nope, okay. So you'll start by threading 1 needle through your first hole. And then on the outside, you'll take this needle, push it through 1 hole, pull it out, and then take the second needle and put it through that same hole so that you have a continuous stitch. There's no gaps in your stitch line there. And what that does is it makes it ridiculously sturdy and durable of a stitch. A lot of the old school leather workers that really are super uptight about making sure everything's super over the top durable, especially saddle makers, they'll actually tie a small knot every single stitch. I don't, because it makes it take 3 times as long and doesn't really give that, like I've never been in a situation where I said, oh darn, I really wish I had a knot in every hole. But
what kind of thread?
Say it again?
What kind of thread do you use?
You use waxed thread. So you can look on Amazon for different, thicknesses of waxed thread like this. It won't show up on camera really well, but it's like a braided, probably synthetic fiber of some kind.
Okay.
That then gets coated in like wax, which I assume is just beeswax. Some people will take like regular twine and wax it themselves. They'll take a stick of beeswax and just run the thread over that. That's another one of the things I don't really get. Why wouldn't you just buy the already waxed thread? But the nice thing about that is then once you're done to finish it off, a lot of people will tie a knot and that's fine, but really all you have to do is just backstitch once or twice. So, go back once or twice, just like you would on a sewing machine. Make sure that both ends of your thread are sticking out the back where you won't see them. And then you can actually just take a small cigarette lighter like this one, have both ends of your thread sticking out the back and just fuse them down. And they essentially form like a little rivet. So you'll snip them with maybe a 1/4, 1/2 inch excess, and then just melt that down and it turns into essentially a little rivet head that keeps it super secure. And I've never had that come undone without having to tie any knot, which is nice because it's quicker and it's also a lot easier. If you're like inside a bag or you're in like a weird place where it can be really hard to get both your hands in to tie a knot, it's a lot easier to flick a lighter than to, tie a square knot deep inside a big old bag. So this is kind of a couple classes in one on accident, but there's a nice box cutter sheath, which can be its own thing. You can get belt clips that you can punch an oblong here and rivet, so you can just set that on your belt just fine. But what I'm going to do is, you can see on this apron here, what do I do with my other strap? Is I actually want it to sit relatively on my hip on my right side, right where my pants pocket is. Mostly just because I've kind of gotten used to just sticking it in my pants pocket there. So that's kind of where I'm used to putting it and then reaching for it. So I'm gonna put mine like right here, essentially. This is my waistline right here. So I'm gonna stitch this down right here. And what I'll do is I'll just contact cement that down. And then I'll just you can take the stitching chisel and repunch the holes. But on something this thin, I'll actually just take my awl here and just poke through each stitching hole and just poke the next hole. And that has two benefits of I don't have to go through with the stitching chisel and the mallet again, but it also helps stretch out each hole a little bit to make it a little easier to pull your needle and your thread through.
Hey, John, I'm gonna have to run. Can I ask you a couple of quick questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are you gonna do to the edge of the body of the apron?
So I actually just leave mine raw. There with chrome tan, you can't burnish it like you can with veg tan because all of the, I think it's collagen and all of the things in the leather that lets you burnish it actually get stripped away in the process. That's why it has so much less body and why it's so much more supple.
Are you gonna bevel it?
You can't really. You
Okay.
can on some thicker, on some like thicker chrome tans that have a little more body, you can. And then
Okay.
you can do what's called edge paint, which is what I have here, this black. So on this is veg tan, so I could burnish it. So I did a light burnish and then I put the edge paint over it. That has the added benefit of also working sort of like a sealant. It's like a rubberized.
Right. So yeah, that's why I was asking. I saw it on TV, but I didn't know what it was.
Yeah. But with
and then
something like this, if you had a sewing machine, you could fold it over and then just run a stitch.
like an edge, yeah.
It would take so ridiculously long though doing it by hand.
Yeah.
That I wouldn't bother.
But there's nothing wrong with leaving it raw.
No, it's not. It's not gonna do anything to the durability of the piece. It's purely aesthetic.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, and that's the same with the veg tan. It's really just so it looks nice. It doesn't do anything for the integrity or the structure.
Got it. Okay. And the other question is, you're gonna send us the stuff with like links to the things and so on, right?
Yeah, I can send you links to all of the tools I use, all the materials we use today.
Okay.
And I
Are you in Decatur?
I am in Decatur, yeah.
Okay. So if we have any questions, can we contact you?
Yeah, absolutely. I can. So you get my email when I send all that stuff out, and then also if you can message me on Slack. If you ever have questions.
Are you on Instagram as well?
I am on Instagram. You can check me out on Instagram at Maccabee_leather_goods.
Got it.
That's where all my leather stuff is.
Are you a big fan of Maccabees?
Yeah, so I'm Jewish, so that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I got that. No, Maccabees is a cappella group that does Jewish songs. My daughter is a big fan.
I haven't heard of them.
Yeah, they throw their latkes in the air sometime. It's pretty corny. You're gonna love it.
Oh, I'll have to check it out.
All right. I'm sorry I have to run. Thanks a lot.
Oh, you're good. Absolutely.
All right. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Awesome.
Take it easy.
Thank you. You too. All righty. Kathy, do you have any other questions?
Nope.
All righty.
I'm gonna try to figure out how to do this.
All right. Yeah. The rest of it's pretty much just the same. Just repeating that over and over to put the pockets onto the apron and then sewing it on. I guess real quick before you go, I can show you for this sort of name tag thing here. All I did was when you wet veg tan leather, just like you can wet form it like we did for this sheath, you can also use different stamps to tool it. So I actually just modeled really quick in Fusion 360 and then 3D printed the stamp. So when the space opens up, which apparently is happening pretty soon, you can just 3D print a stamp like this if you want to put like your name or something on it. So I have a couple of these in different sizes that I use. So that's
you should do like a whole alphabet and then make it so you can slide them in and out of the holder so you can do it.
So they sell. You can also buy things like that, but they're also kind of expensive.
Well, that's why I said just 3D print it.
Yeah. So the only benefit to buying them is they're machined out of brass. So you can put them in a different machine that heats it up, and then you can do like if you've ever seen like a leather bag that has like the logo in like gold foil. They have this weird gold foil that they have a stamp that gets super hot, and then where that stamp presses down, for some reason that stays, and then the rest of it you can like brush off, sort of like gold leaf. So that's the only benefit really to the store-bought over the 3D printed, but I don't have any intention of doing that anyway, so I just go with this. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Just
You.
doing it over and over again. So if you have any questions, let me know.
Okay.
I'm on Slack
Yep.
probably a little too often. So,
Me
you know,
too.
I'll see if you message me or anything. And if you want help making one for your own, making one for yourself, I have plenty of this leather left over. Um,
Yeah,
if
but
you don't-
it's not thick enough for what's called kickback.
Yeah,
So when something comes, that's mainly why woodworkers wear it is,
so you should probably look into the apron split on Weaver's website. I'll send that in the set of links I send. But it's pretty beefy. And they're awesome because you can order like a 2 or 3 inch square sample for free, so you can get an idea of just how heavy it is and if you think it'll work for you or not. That they'll send you for free
Okay.
before you buy a, you know.
yeah, I mean, granted, I have a saw stop just like we have in the shop, but
Yeah.
that doesn't stop kickback. So
Yeah.
Yep.
All righty. Well, thanks for coming.
Thanks.
That's really about it.
all right.
Let me know if you have any questions. And theoretically, we'll be doing another one soon on a card wallet.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, that'll be this guy. So, all right. Well, thanks for coming.
Thanks. Thank you. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.